Okay, so this video is going to be a little bit different than most of the videos I do. Rather than looking at like a collection of functionality that creates a skill tree or inventory system, I want to look at just one concept, and that is variables. And the reason for that is because a lot of times you may not realize that there's data you have to capture, and you can capture that just by assigning a variable. Now, often a variable, you have values that you want to assign it, like yes or no, or whatever, but a variable can also be used to grab numbers that you never know yourself. You never actually put those numbers in, but you may need to track those numbers. Like say an object has been given a velocity, and for some reason you need to capture at a certain point where its position is. Maybe you've gone to a pause menu, maybe you went to a sub menu, and so when you come back you need everything to appear where it was. Well, you can capture those positions with variables. So I just opened up a script here, and I haven't done anything yet. There's two types of variables, generally speaking, static and non-static. I'm not quite sure what the official term for a non-static is, but we'll get to statics in a minute. So basically, if you declare a variable, so say public integers, and we'll just call this randoms. So that would be non-decimals. You can do floats. So a float allows for decimals. Now the thing about float is very often if you put in decimal, like say it's 2.5, got to make sure you put the F after it. So even though you've declared it as a float, got to make sure you put that F in. Often you have to do that when you actually also if you put a constant into a statement that is looking for a value, very often you have to drop that F in so it realizes it's a decimal. So non-decimals, decimals, we can do strings. So this would be text, maybe maybe it's dialogue, and maybe you want to define this ahead of time and you have a whole conversation. String can also include numbers that you don't want to manipulate with calculations, like phone numbers, social security numbers, maybe a street address that has a number. So you can put numbers into a string. You just have to, it's just that you can't manipulate it like a number. But you can do other things as well, like public sprite. So with a public sprite, you can actually change an image. So I can think of a couple examples. Maybe you have, you're playing a game of Remember or Memory or whatever you call it, where you have all these cards face down. When you click on it, you want the image to change. You want it to change to the other side of the card so you can see that it's a king or an ace or a 2 or whatever. So you can actually change the sprite like that. So maybe based on a mouse click or based on some other kind of event, you can actually change what image is being displayed. Maybe it's maybe you're not using animation sequences, but you want a basic single frame to indicate that they're in a jump motion or something. Then you can do that as well. So that's when you want to change an image. You can also do, as I mentioned in the introduction, locations, or should I say positions. So like new vector 3 or vector 2, you can call it whatever. So I could actually capture a position using this, and what's kind of interesting, you usually think of a variable having a single value at any given time, like this is a single value. Technically this is a single value because it's a long string. This actually contains 3 values because it contains an x, y, and a z. So if for some reason you need to capture a value of a position and it's not a position that you specifically assigned, then that's how you can do it. You can capture the value that way. And actually the new wouldn't be there, sorry, it would just be public vector 3. So integers, floats, strings, sprites, vectors. You can do booleans, might be mispronouncing that. And these have two values, either true or false. Oops, sorry, I didn't put this in. So you can either be true or it can be false. Now, unless there's some functionality that I'm unaware of, I usually don't use these. I'm sure there's legitimate reasons for them, which is why they exist. But very often, I just use a string. Like I'll do a public string, and I have it be set to one of two values: yes or no, true or false, on or off. But if you want to get technical, you probably could use a boolean, and because it can only have two values. If you notice, it's not in quotes. It's not the word true. It's actually the value true. And so that's another type of variable. Transforms. A transform would be an actual game object, like say a prefab that you want to instantiate. So an enemy ship needs, you've created the enemy ship as a prefab and you need to instantiate it. Well, the transform variable is how you would actually call that object. So it would actually be instantiate game thing, give it a location, give it a rotation. So yeah, that would be an actual object, like a game object that you're trying to instantiate. Or it doesn't have to be an instantiation. It could be, say, another object that's already in the scene, so you're not instantiating it per se, but you need to manipulate it for some reason. So public transform, or should I say transform, is when you're trying to be able to modify a game object. So something that has a sprite or a transform, you're trying to actually manipulate it. Maybe manipulate its location, its position, its rotation, its color, and so you have to create a variable to able to address that variable. So I think those are the most common ones. I'm sure there's ones that I'm forgetting, but I really wanted to point this out because I think sometimes, particularly people who've been programming for a while, in the old days, so to speak, we really only had numeric variables and string variables. That was it. So now, just about, like I said, almost any kind of data you can think of can now be stored in a variable and can be summoned or manipulated in some way. And then once you have these variables, like I said, you can change them. So for instance, you have this vector 3. You could actually go, you could actually modify this. So you could do current position .x, and now you can change the x component of this vector 3, or current position .y plus 5. You've modified the y position. So maybe it's a teleport spell that you've hit someone with a teleport spell and they have to go to somewhere in the screen. You've pushed them back or whatever. So I said there were two general types of variables, and that is static and non-static. These are all non-static. They do not have the word static, which means that the script that that contains these variables, whatever object this script is attached to, only that object will be aware of that value. So say I had a value that said public int enemy HP. If I attach that script to, say, 50 different enemies, each enemy would have its own HP. That the enemy HP variable would actually have a unique value, a discrete value for each and every enemy. That even though it shares the same name, because it's a non-static variable, each and every one would have their own, which is, when you think about it, exactly what you want. Very rarely do you want a group of enemy enemies to share HP. You might for some unique scenario, but otherwise you generally don't want that. You don't want a group to share HP. You want each individual object to have its own HP. So what's a static variable? Basically, you just drop in the word static. So this is a very important a very important concept to understand early on, because this is how you transfer information from one object within a scene to another object in the scene, or to different scenes. Like for instance, player HP. So we gave the example of enemy HP. Well, player HP, you don't want it to reset. Again, might be a scenario where you do, but you can still use a static variable and attain that just by saying, okay, at a certain point you set the variable to a certain value. So this is where you don't want a variable to reset itself, because in the example of the enemy, you instantiate the enemy, it's going to instantiate with the default value, its own value, in the case of their HP. Whereas with the player HP, you want to track that. You want that to be accessible, because maybe that HP has to be displayed in a health bar, or has to be displayed in a menu screen, or has to be saved. You want to be able to access that value, and you don't want it to be reset. So when you want something to be accessible to multiple objects, particularly multiple scenes, you want to use static variables. So, static, maybe it's an int, and it's player HP. Maybe you've, like in a quest log, you want to keep track of how many rats have been killed, because you have to kill 10 rats for a quest. That's probably going to be a static variable. You shut your game off, or you go into a new area, you take on some other quest, you want that variable to not reset. So you want it to be static. So for like a quest log, you'd want to do something like that. So those are the two basic type of variables, static and non-static. If someone wants to drop in the comments what you call a non-static variable, I call them local, but that's probably the wrong term. But the main difference, like I said, is if you don't declare it as static, then it's only accessible to the object the script is attached to. If you attach it to 50 different objects, each one has a unique, discrete version of that variable. If you declare it as a static, though, then it is not changing, and there will only be one version of that. So I think that's about it. If there's any questions, any other kind of variables, if you want to see examples of these in use, I mean, I probably could come up with some, but I realized that to come up with enough examples would make this really kind of cumbersome. So if there's any more that you'd like to see, just let me know, and maybe I could put up some examples.